the high point. The high point of my name is Judson Chiu. There's some familiar faces here. Some of you I've known for a while, and some of you I look forward to meeting if I haven't met you yet. And I am proud to be here on behalf of David. I'm here on my own free will, my free time. David is at the Board of Supervisors meeting. They are still meeting, and I think we'll be for a couple more hours. But he appreciated the invitation to come tonight and wanted to make sure that someone was here to speak on his behalf, and I'm very, very proud to do that. I think the subject of tonight's forum is explicitly rent control and issues related to housing renters. And so I was going to talk a little bit about David's vision for that and also his record so far. I'll keep those remarks short. I will talk directly about Park Merced and then answer questions that you have. But I wanted to start out by saying that David is 100% committed to rent control, to tenants' rights, and to the movement that so many of you here represent. He is one of the few tenants on the Board of Supervisors. He's very proud of that. He's been a tenant activist since he came to San Francisco about 15 years ago, right exactly when I did actually. And I'm also a tenant, I should say, longtime tenant in the Western Addition Hayes Valley area. And I think he's just committed to continuing to work on the incredible challenges of affordable housing and tenants' rights in San Francisco. As you know, David represents District 3, which is really ground zero, I think, for a lot of Ellis Act evictions, for all sorts of pressures that you see on housing prices. And David has fought with his Chinatown allies, North Beach allies, every individual Ellis Act eviction that has come before us, and we both either tried to help overturn them with the help of attorneys at the Tenderloin Housing Clinic, like on Jasper Place, or negotiated the best possible package and really transition that folks could get, as on Greenwich Street, which some of you may know about. And David has really worked when he was chair of the CCDC Board of Directors to increase the supply of affordable housing in San Francisco. And we know that for San Francisco to be the city that we all want it to be in the future, we have to do a much better job of building affordable housing and for very low-income San Franciscans as well. And related directly to rent control, when the Palmer decision that some of you may have heard of threatened some of the inclusionary housing provisions that San Francisco has, David helped carry the legislation over many, many months. It was started before I worked in his office, but got there to make San Francisco's inclusionary housing laws as strong as possible. So he really does not in any way support the erosion of rent control, inclusionary housing, and I want to really emphasize that. So let me just get to Park Merced right away and just talk a little bit about that. I've been very close to it, and just describe the policy rationale and why David supported the project, and then I'm happy to take very specific questions because I know there are a lot of knowledgeable people in the room. And I think the fundamental question around Park Merced was, could rent control be protected on the replacement units? Park Merced is a mixture of townhouses or garden apartments and the towers, and the plan that the developer has, that the city's been working on with the developer for years, is to replace the existing garden apartments and townhouses with higher density on the west side of San Francisco, and to make sure that those rent control units continue to have rent control when they're rebuilt in a denser at about 3 times the number of units. And I want to just take everybody back to Trinity for a second. Everybody's very familiar, worked hard on it. And the Trinity agreement essentially protects rent control with a general waiver of Costa-Hawkins of rent control in the development agreement. What Trinity basically says is, yeah. So I know I talk really quickly, so that's why I'm going to go fast and then questions. So I'm from the Midwest. So I don't know why I talk so fast. I should talk more slowly. But yeah, maybe I'll just lean back a little bit. Unless that bothers you. Sorry. No, that's fine, Judson. It's been a busy couple weeks for sure. So Trinity, Park Merced, development agreements, right? They're agreements between the city and the developer on all the terms, the planning issues, and most importantly in both the rent control for the replacement units. And Trinity Plaza relied on basically the developer saying, I waive my rights to Costa-Hawkins. What Costa-Hawkins, the state law says, is that new rental units cannot have rent control on them, and that's if we could go up to, I know you've heard from some of our Sacramento delegation, if we could go up to Sacramento and change Costa-Hawkins, we would, and we will advocate for that and work for that. But Costa-Hawkins basically says you can't have rent control on new units. accept, and I'll get to the accept in a second. But what Trinity did is basically say, the developer says, okay, regardless of Costa-Hawkins, we will respect rent control on new units. We agree to rent control on new units. What some court decisions have said since Trinity was signed is that there's some question about a general waiver of Costa-Hawkins. Basically, a developer does not necessarily have, and there have been two decisions, one directly related, but basically a developer, because Costa-Hawkins is so strong, a developer cannot just generally waive it, and then if a future owner says, oh, I don't want to do rent control anymore, they were coerced into waiving it, okay, rent control out the window. It's danger. So what Park Merced does to build on Trinity is Costa-Hawkins has two specific exceptions that allow for rent control on new units. One is if it's essentially publicly funded project, if there's city money, public money in the project. That is clearly not the case in Park Merced. It's an entirely private project that incidentally includes $500 million of public benefits, transit, open space, those kind of things over the course of development. So that's number one. The second exception under Costa-Hawkins, and this is the crux, and I'm sure David will be talking about this a lot this year, and I just want to take, before I sort of get to that, I want to say that I'm here because David is always committed to talking to anyone about anything. We know that there's a fun article brewing in The Guardian. I'm sure you'll all read it in the next couple of weeks. We know it's not going to be particularly positive. David has given them access and talked to them and given them his perspective. And that's something that he believes in, that his campaign, his office believe in, and it's just fundamentally what David is about. So that's why I wanted to explain this. So Costa-Hawkins, the second exception essentially says that if the developer is granted density bonus under a state law around other forms of assistance around similar to density bonus that's in a state law, then they can basically, that can be an exception to Costa-Hawkins. So that's what it says.
What does that mean?
What that means basically is if the developer is getting higher density than the existing zoning, then they can basically agree not to abide by Costa-Hawkins. There's not been a court case directly related to this, probably in part because it's a pretty clear exception. So Park Merced relies squarely on that exception, and and David believes that protects rent control, and I'm happy to talk about that. Now, on May 24th, after negotiations with the developer and the mayor's office, that some of the tenant advocates that we all respect had also participated in over the weeks, but then broke away from at the end, David did negotiate further protections for tenants related to the Park Merced agreement. And the one I'll mention is basically this, that if either a future owner or developer or a court basically said that I was wrong, what I just said is wrong, and rent control is not valid under this exception, or we didn't apply to this exception, then that gets kind of bracketed out, and basically the owner or developer would have to pay the difference between between the rent control value of the rent control units and without rent control, which is now about $160 million, plus 20% to administer a voucher program to essentially subsidize the rent of the folks who had rent control. So it's basically a backstop in case there's an issue with that Costa-Hawkins provision, which we don't believe there will be. So it's really sort of a worst case scenario. The other worst case scenario that I just want to mention that I don't think has been part of the public discussion that much about Park Merced is, especially during the construction piece and before construction, if the rent control is threatened, if tenant groups sue and something happens, then all the entitlements rights cease. The developer has no right to build and to follow through on their entitlements if the rent control is threatened or thrown out. So I wanted to make that clear too. So I know it's complicated. I was familiar with Costa-Hawkins, but now I've read it about 100 times and looked at this particular exception. And like, people can disagree. Supervisors can disagree. Very well-informed lawyers and tenant advocates can disagree. But I genuinely believe that David believes very strongly that tenant rights will be protected and that rent control will be protected, or he would not have supported the agreement. So that's what I want to finish. I could talk more about his record, but I wanted to make sure that I did get that out. I'm not going to call it.
Let's do Tommy, Rick, Howard, Paul.
Okay, so Justin,
Even my mom messes it up sometimes.
like Hudson with a J.
Judson.
Thanks, Rocky. Thanks, Rocky. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I had a roommate. My last roommate before I finally lived alone, which I highly recommend, is
Not an option for many of us trainers. Sorry.
Rent control, 12 years, same place. 12 place. It was Judson, so that was awkward when we went out.
Judson and Judson.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway.
So, I mean, I don't share your optimism about Costa Hawkins as a tenant counselor for the last 11 years and having to deal with Costa Hawkins all the time in my office. First of all, I don't understand how you could read it 100 times. I can barely get through it.
Especially that piece. I wish I'd brought it, actually.
It's gibberish. Costa Hawkins is legal crap devised by crazed lawyers that should be in insane asylums rather than in the legislature. Anyway, I don't share your optimism about it, but I think, and Dean Preston and other folks have said to me, worst case scenario is a court just strikes down everything, including the penalty thing. I mean, everything just gets struck down, and it could happen. A court could strike all of it down. And then where are we? We're left with nothing. But even if the rent control is maintained, let's give you the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, the rent control stays. However, what about the gentrification factor of what you're doing to that area of the city? That's going to cause massive gentrification, which always causes displacement and always erodes rent control, because there's always incentive then for landlords to get out long-term tenants and to bring in tenants who are going to pay higher income. So you're unleashing this huge monster of gentrification onto that area, just like the Twitter deal unleashes gentrification on the 6th and Market, that whole market area, and the Tenderloin, and south of Market maybe even. So, I mean, nobody talks about the gentrification factor as well. So even if rent control is maintained, we saw during the dot-com boom that having rent control doesn't stop gentrification, doesn't protect long-term tenants. I live in the Castro. Man, did we learn the lesson that rent control doesn't mean a hell of a beans when you've got money, a buck to be made.
I think that's a big question about development in general in the city that everybody has to address, and that's where San Francisco's affordable housing provisions, inclusionary housing, and the real need to build more inclusionary housing comes in, because development is going to happen. It's going to happen. I mean, one of the things about Park Merced that was made it attractive to David is that so much of the development pressure is on the east side of the city, and I think that it's important that the west side also see some densification, and I think that the affordable housing funding that comes out of the project is going to have to be used intelligently to fight the gentrification pressures that are. I mean, I live in a neighborhood. I completely get gentrification issues. I live in, like I said, Western Edition, Hayes Valley. I mean, on an L around me, there's public housing, and on the other L, there's La Boulange. And it's real.
But how do you fight it? You don't fight it with.
I mean, I think the city.
I think these developers are all opting out of those. Out of the inclusionary housing.
So that's why the city has to find a way to use the fees if they do opt out, and that's I mean, it's hard to stop the opting out, but I think we should have more on-site affordable housing. I thought the 55 Laguna dialogue was important, but I mean, gentrification. I don't have a silver bullet for gentrification.
Dudley Street, Boston, Dudley Street.
But I think that's a good conversation to continue to have.
Great name.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming tonight. You're coming into the belly of the beast, especially if you've been reading my Facebook messages to you.
I just
Nicole
Facebook.
Dursey,
I don't have time. No.
My old friend Nicole from the Matt Gonzalez campaign. Apparently, Mar, Avalos, Mercurini, Campos, and Kim understood what Tommy, Brian, Kevin understand about Park Merced. Why, at this point, David Chiu doesn't get it? An alleged progressive. I turned the cheek on the interim mayor. I turned my cheek on Twitter. But him turning his back on tenants and sending you, brilliant as you are, well-informed, you read the Augusta until 100 times. I've hardly not even read it once. My partner and I, Chuck, raised our 2 kids in a garden apartment. Chuck was just 72 and 19th. He looks at the prospect now of losing his home of 40 years. And you and David Chiu need to do something to make sure that Chuck and the other 1,537 rent control units don't get into this discussion that you and Tommy had about, well, there'll be funding and the worst case scenario, 160 million. I am so furious with David Chiu that I can barely contain it. And turning his back on renters means that he stinks. And I think his campaign for mayor, when you piss off your base, like Jeff Adachi did last year, that's a really dumb thing to do. And he's just done it. And I hope you convey
Rick,
anger
I'm sorry
that is
that
felt.
you feel that way, and that you feel that way, and that. But I think that
I think the voters are going to show you.
I think that
Chiu is doomed now as mayor. Doomed.
I'm not going to get into that, but I think
But he
that
is.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead.
I don't think that he's going to have to leave his home unless there's a replacement unit that has rent control, and that's one of the things that we did today, that David did today, that came out of a conversation with Polly Marshall and Mitchell, was to prohibit ever having any operation and maintenance costs passed on to existing tenants. There was going to be essentially incremental O&M costs, just like everybody else has. Once they move into replacement units, after Polly pushed that was eliminated, and that was put into the development agreement on Friday. And so, we tried to do everything we can to protect the existing tenants, to ensure that they have rent control, to ensure that they don't have increased rent, and also some of the final, the very last phase of the project, which is probably going to be in 15 or 20 years, there are 200 units that are being protected until the very last phase. So it's, we expect a lot of folks who've lived there a long time to be in those units until the very last phase of the project.
Shame on you and shame on
I just,
Go ahead, Howard.
it's a passionate city.
Hi, I want you to really get this message back to David, because I was for David Chiu when he was progressive. But when he did what he did to Twitter, angered me. And also, he got houses, apartments, sitting in his district, have not been lived in for 10 or 15 years. I know, because I took over some of those houses. And I will do it again. You should have people living in those homes, not sitting empty. And David can push that, but he will not. And I vote to David, I will not vote for him.
So you're asking for a tax on vacant units?
Yes.
I know there's a lot of discussion about vacant
Turn
buildings.
it into a policy.
Paul Hogarth.
Okay, I got 2 questions about park concern. One is more procedural. How does David Chiu explain introducing amendments at a committee in the morning and having the Board of Supervisors vote on it in the afternoon? To me, even if we give David every benefit of the doubt, I am extremely concerned
I read
about...
Dean's piece this morning.
No, and so I want you to answer that. The other thing, too, is let's just say all of those promises about rent control protections are true and the courts just kind of go our way and everything goes fine. Having been intimately involved in the Trinity Plaza redevelopment, Trinity tenants got a very tangible benefit from that deal. They got exactly the same unit, exactly the same rent forever in units, and believe me, I went to the Trinity Plaza units where they used to live and where they live now. It's like night and day. So
Do you promise me you'll do the same thing?
I will do the same thing with Park Merced, but here's my concern. What exactly are Park Merced tenants who are living there now with rent control benefiting from this deal?
They also get brand new units with with all the modern amenities and at the same rent.
Their apartments are cute.
And they don't have any of the pass-throughs, like I said. And I think that it's going to be a similar situation. And I think I look forward to going out there with you when the first units are built on vacant land. You would not know from reading some of the coverage of Park Merced that that people will move directly from existing units into replacement units. It's like they're going to be kicked out on the street like tomorrow because of David Chiu, and then they're going to be just nowhere to go until some day down the line when they have a replacement unit. That is not the case. They will move directly into replacement units with rent control, with all the modern amenities, just like at Trinity. And I look forward to visiting with you, Paul. And on the first question, I think when the Park Merced hearing happened in late March, that some of you may have followed, after that hearing, there was an ongoing, lengthy negotiation discussion between tenant advocates and the developer that we were not directly a part of, where most of the ideas that were presented that day came about. We only got the final language on those that day, but they did not in any fundamental way change the rent control that I talked about around Costa Hawkins. And we really worked to explain them, and they were not amendments to an ordinance, they were changes to an underlying development agreement. The mayor's office and others, like we saw with America's Cup, they actually have the legal authority to make those kind of changes even after the board approves them. So there's not a legal issue there, I guarantee it.
So what's the
I would
difference
ask
between substantial and
my good friend in the back.
What's the difference between substantial and substantive?
I can't speak to the city attorney's specific language on that, but the bottom line is, and this gets super technical, and I've been in City Hall too long, but there was not the ordinance approving the development agreement. A word did not change. Not a single word changed in that ordinance. What changed is the underlying development agreement. Supervisors are making changes to the underlying development agreement on Treasure Island right now at the full board, and are probably going. Likely to support the project after that. It is not any different. And the other thing I want to say is that in the last 2 weeks, because there were 2 votes on the ordinance, we did sit down with Polly and Mitchell and the city attorney and the developer and the mayor's office and went through some of these remaining issues and got the O&M issue fixed and further strengthened the already complete impossibility of ever condo mapping the towers, which is another sort of tangential issue. So it's just, not only were most of those issues already being discussed with folks, but we have had the 2 weeks since the initial vote to go over them as well. And out of the 14 pages, something like 9 or 10 pages of it was essentially, just sort of standard language on how to come up with an arbitration agreement on what the cost, what the value of that difference between rent control and not rent control would be. It's basically boilerplate. So the idea that it's like vast changes in the 14 pages is not accurate either.
Rafi?
So,
Does anybody have some water? There's a lot of this cheap. What's that? Thanks.
I have 2 Park Merced questions. And one is sort of...
Although Park Merced is one word, it's important to remember.
Okay, all right. One is that, there's this idea that people, moving across the street or whatever is an insignificant hardship. But for many people, they've raised their kids there. This is a place where they built a home.
Sure.
If these were, and in San Francisco we act like, that thing that lawyers learn in law school about property being a bundle of sticks. Well, we act like when you rent, you have a real important bundle. And it's kind of, in San Francisco, kind of like owning. And if anyone, anywhere in this country, if any municipal government proposed condemning 1,500 ownership units to create 1,500, or to create something better or more attractive, in fact, we have Supreme Court cases that would, limit takings. That's how takings cases get to the Supreme Court. So the idea, I'm curious how, this is not Cabrini Green. This is not dilapidated public housing. It's not even a old, broken down motel in one of the hardest to, resuscitate sections of San Francisco. This is like, it's not where I want to live, but it's a place where a whole bunch of people want to live and have built a home and a life, and they're doing their thing out there. And it seems like a pretty massive dislocation because there's some money to be made on it, and some of us think that they should be living more densely. So I'm wondering how that factored into this.
It's very eloquent. Go ahead.
Secondly, I'm wondering if there were any tenant groups that signed on to this compromise. Because to me, I understand wanting to bring the sides together, but what's kind of hard is if you are actually providing leadership on the left, or leadership to tenant organizations, leadership to tenants, and then you make a deal that does not include any support from those groups and organizations, it seems to me that there's a disconnect there. So those are my two.
Let me take the second one first. As I mentioned, there were extensive negotiations, and admittedly, Ted and Dean and Mitchell did not get there. David and I sat down with them for 2 hours on Monday afternoon just to kind of talk through all the Costa Hawkins issues, some of the issues you talked about, and you know, David obviously would have much preferred to have brokered a compromise that had the support of the tenant advocates that he's, you know, stood side by side with, you know, with megaphones in North Beach for years, and so it's a disappointment. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But ultimately, David was elected to make tough decisions about the future of the city, and that's what he believed that he did. And I mean, I think that, you know, I think that. I think it would have been, we would have preferred to have agreement. Now there are some tenant groups and tenants that we've heard from extensively, not just affiliated with the developer, who do support the project. I mean, when Dave and I went out there in late March for 2.5, 3 hours for sort of a walkthrough with the developer and proponents, and then with many of the tenants and tenant advocates opposed to the project, I actually peeled off for about 45 minutes and just kind of did I went to journalism school, so I did the kind of, you know, person on the street thing and asked people what they thought of it, and you know, because I didn't want everybody who was just lined up with one side, and it was a little, probably tilted a little bit in favor of the project. Most of the people I talked to were not people who had been there, you know, forever. The people who have been there. The average, I think, is 5 years about for tenancy out there. A lot of folks know that state students live there and everything, and so. You know, the idea that it's uniformly opposed by tenants there is not the case. So that's the response to the second point. On the first one, I think, you know, as a renter, as a tenant, and David as a tenant, I know what you mean. I feel like sometimes, like, the fact that I'm not that interested personally in homeownership is almost, you know, it feels perfectly normal in San Francisco, but I, you know, go to a wedding and talk to my cousins from Nebraska, and they can't even fathom it. You know, like, you're going to rent your whole life. I'm like, yeah, maybe. You know, I don't have a problem with that. I get to call somebody when, you know, there's a problem. You know, that I'm not very handy. So, you know, so I think you make a real point about what it means to rent in San Francisco that you know, hits home. But I also think that the reality of what would happen at Park Merced, and what could happen, I'm not going to predict the future, but what could happen at Park Merced if this development agreement and this project did not move forward is also very real. I heard talked to Ted Gullickson a lot about the Ellis Act. The Ellis Act is entirely available to the current and future owner of Park Merced today, right now, right this second. And given the financials of what these folks like to do, I don't think it's all that unlikely that they'd start to Ellis it piece by piece. We could have I can imagine what that would do in the city, but you know, in terms of the response, but that's entirely a possibility. So it's
well, no, because, you know, there are reasons that Ellis Act evictions are in smaller properties, but then there's the whole.
Well, if it gets parcel, I mean, they could sell it piece by piece.
Yeah,
but they could sell it piece by piece.
If you're talking about 5 or more units, there's a whole other issue.
Oh, I know. That's why the towers are never going to get like condoized and stuff. But they could sell it piece by piece, and you know, that's what they've done to SF State already. The second thing is just the issue about pass-throughs and what it's going to cost to rehabilitate these, you know, not so well-built units from the 40s. You know, I've talked to people specifically about insulation issues and dry rot
What's
and those
not
kind
so
of
well built? The garden apartment that I've been in for 40 years?
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, you want to come out there tonight? I'll tell Chuck we're coming over.
People always do that. They
Yeah.
try to
If
talk
you-
Yeah. There's always talk
Not
about
so
that.
well
You're
built.
always
Look,
talking that stuff down. Don't
Yeah, I'm just saying I'm just pointing out what could be possible. So, you know, just that more renovations could result in higher pass-throughs. So that's not a particularly poetic response to your poetry, but you know, I think it's honest. So.
So Tommy, I think you got one, and then I think
I do have to go back to City Hall eventually.
To go on to another topic, just for a moment. So, where does David stand on this thing that's floating around about letting 2,000 TICs condo convert, slip through the condo conversion process? There's talk about that. I know the idea's kind of been put on the back burner for a moment, but
Yeah, it's not part of the mayor's budget.
no, it's not part of the budget right now. But
I mean, David stood squarely in opposition to Mayor Newsom's proposal last year, and I think this is a case where there's no. I think TICs are a real issue. I'm sure you guys have already talked about that some tonight. But TICs and the challenge that they face, that they create. But David would not support standalone condo conversion of TICs without a broader compromise.
What is broader compromise?
Whatever
mean?
I think without someone without a real
without broad support from the tenants world.
Yes.
Don't put words in
Because I mean, the reality
Yeah,
is,
it's true. No, it's true. Without broad support, and we've sat down with them about it, and I think it's not in the mayor's budget for a number of reasons. I think, but one big reason is because that there is no agreement there.
And those people who are trying to make that proposal, it's a $600 million giveaway to TIC owners. And so I think that if we're trying to craft a fair compromise, I think that might be hard to reach. To give away
$600 million in benefits.
and I have to say, realistically, I think that if Ed Lee got elected, and if he does run and he gets elected, I think it will be on the table really quickly. And I just wonder about what compromise David Chiu would go for, considering that, I was part of the tenant group that was talking about the idea of what we might want in exchange for that. And I was of the position that there's nothing that I want in exchange for letting 2,000 CICs convert. There's nothing at all. But there has been talk, and I just wonder, because I guess my fear is that that's going to happen, that in the next couple of years, that's going to happen. There's going to be something pushed through, and it's going to be pushed through the board, and I wonder if we have the 6 votes. Do we have 6 votes to oppose that?
I mean, it's not in the mayor's budget for a reason, I would say. So,
it's not even right now. Because
so,
because the mayor knows that it's too much of a hot button issue at this moment. But should he get elected in November, I'm not sure.
I didn't realize he was a candidate.
Well, he's not. Well, there's that bogus campaign going on. If you saw Michael Trellis's great piece about the phony photo shoot outside.
I did see that. Yeah.
Outside of Rainbow the other day. But even if he doesn't get elected, if somebody else gets elected who might also, I mean, there's other candidates who I think would also push it through.
No,
Duffy's endorsed it.
Yeah, I mean it's been a close vote at the board, so I think it's a concern. I think that
and it's a concern for me whether David is with us because he's our 6th vote against that.
David is with you.
Right.
You heard it, folks.
I said right.
You got that recorded.
Yep, it's right here.
My last
30.
My last name requires a certain level of honesty, not always present in politics. So.
32 minutes.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, this is
So remember, folks,